Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored and delighted to have Bill Rowe back. And today, we're going to be talking about the contributions of Julian Jaynes. So one of the things that we do in this meetups is that we focus on thinkers who have had seminal ideas, which really are game-changing, but they have not received enough attention. And what we want to do is we want to identify those ideas, talk about them so that many more people start investigating them and using them. All right, so Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. So how did you discover Julian Jaynes?
Well, yeah, maybe I mentioned a university. I lived in Santa Cruz, California, and Bookshop Santa Cruz had this beautiful looking book on the shelf one day. Where'd it go? Well, this one. And thought I had my original. And so I opened it in the store and read that, "Oh, what a world of unseen." I've read that opening passage, which I consider one of the most beautiful written opening passages in English. So I bought the book, and I did not understand what I read it all the way through, and but I was working at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So after a couple of weeks, I went to a classicist there and just asked him. I said, "Would you look at the references on this guy? What do you think?" And he spent a few minutes, and then he blessed all of Julian Jaynes' references and said, "Yep, this guy knows what he's talking about." So then I just kept going. And kept reading. What
really drew you in?
Well, I can, I have a very vivid memory of this. It's interesting you asked. There are three things that actually have haunted me from that first reading, and they're I'll tell you what they are, but they're really like songs that you can't get out of your head. And they're just they're throwaway lines in some places, but I can tell you what the three things are.
Please.
Since that's what it's been for me. So the first was what Jaynes said. I can tell you the page 53, where he says, "There can be nothing in immediate experience that is like immediate experience itself." And I thought that was really profound, because people who chase after the heart problem, the point Jaynes was making is that whenever we say we understand something, we come to an aha moment. We go, "Oh, I get it." And usually that he gives the Bohr example, built Bohr atom, that just a bunch of numbers. And then one guy finally says, "Hey, that looks like a little solar system. Oh, I get it now." Or, you got a lot of numbers about what's an economy. "Oh, I can manipulate this." "Oh, the economy is like a building. I get it." Jaynes pointed out that ain't going to happen with what he called immediate experience, because there can be nothing that it is like. So that was a wow moment for me, and a, "oh my gosh, I'm not going to get there" moment. So that was one thing that continued to haunt me. And then the other thing, sort of a corollary to that, is his discussion of what happens if you do keep pressing. Suppose you keep trying. I think he had a kind of a beautifully melancholic way of saying it. And I've got it here in front of me, that if we press too hard or too strongly, we feel this vague sense of irritation, as if something didn't want to be known, and that it was ungrateful if you'd even ask. And then he finished that off with, "It was like experiencing rudeness in an otherwise friendly place." And that's how I felt too. I was asking my brain or my mind to please tell me, and they weren't cooperating. I wasn't getting there. So, but that haunted me. I kept saying to myself, I've got to see what he means by that. And so that kept me going. And then the last thing that sort of kept me on a more looking toward research, was what he said about the conversation. And on page 97, he says that to have a conversation, we have to become the other person, or we have to suspend our identity for a while and let them in. And then he said, to hear is a kind of obedience. And he even cited that the word obey, the Latin origin of it is to hear facing someone. So that whole idea, you made it so clear that a conversation is not the trivial thing I thought it was, having talked my whole life on that. No, it was a somewhat dangerous moment. You turn over something essential to your being to another person for a short while, and then you trade places. And the conversation is like a safe zone where you can be wrong and they can be wrong, but you stay engaged. But that was one of the three things that haunted me. And I had to, from that point on, I was searching for the particular answer at the lowest level I could go and not violate the level at which the question was asked in the first place. And I think I found it. I didn't find it. Other people found it for me. I can name them if we go on. Those are the two big things that would not go away, that I remember them like songs and they went through my head daily.
Wow. 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 So then what did you do with all these things playing in your head? How did you proceed in your investigation?
So through the 80s, occasionally I would try the ideas out on my friends and everybody, except one, my music partner, thought I was crazy. But that kept, being called crazy is okay. It can be motivating. But I really wasn't getting anywhere until the 90s. And I decided, I was working in the physics department, high energy physics. So looking for particles, not a lot of, I was about to say not a lot of social science, but just one, it was the most social environment I've ever been in, that particular high energy physics group. My day was filled with people who were nothing but chatterboxes. It was wonderful, but I wasn't getting anywhere with consciousness with them. So I started hanging out in the psychology department. And they were very welcoming. And it was there that I met some of the students of Michael Tomasello, who some of you may be familiar with. And they encouraged me to where I was already kind of heading, that I was beginning to get a sense that even if I was going to discover Chalmers, the heart problem, I had to be able to peer through what we learn as infants and young adults, what we learn from this second order way of talking about ourselves. And so I quickly realized that you got to do this. You got to figure out childhood, infancy to roughly age 7. And so that's what I bore down on pretty hard. And I got really lucky in that they let me hang out in a seminar in the philosophy department. And it was summer long. So I just sat there and listened to these people. But they introduced me to Daniel Stern, the interpersonal world of the infant, and other things related to this. This is called forms of vitality. And he introduced the terms like vitality affects, that we really experience ourselves, he said, in terms of surging or fading or pulsing. We're not digital, we're always analog. That was huge to me. And then I following him in the 70s, maybe you remember the last time I said, I found the work of a cadre of developmental psychologists who could afford VCRs in the 70s. And they filmed mothers and infants just to see what they were doing. And they were shocked. And their papers, the titles and the contents blossomed with musical terms, duetting between mother and child, rhythmic engagement, and all this. And I knew I was onto something here, that they developed that stuff, and it kind of sat on a shelf. Not a lot of psychologists used it. And that just drove me crazy. This is a gold mine, I said, that answers so many questions that people like psychologists Vygotsky and George Herbert Mead would say we become a self through other people, but they didn't have experimental evidence about what through meant. These guys had it. Through meant a very intimate, rhythmically entrained relationship of a very helpless infant to a caregiver. By the end of 9 months of that, you have everything, a healthy infant in a nurturing environment, everything you need to know that the world is seen different from other people.
Wow. So what I want to do is two things. Firstly, so the question that was raised in your mind about conversation, kind of centrality of conversation in the operation of human consciousness, you're now going and saying, oh, this is right from the beginning. This is built right from the beginning. This is how consciousness is built, through this conversation. Now, you did a full meetup on this, a full presentation on it, but many people who are watching this video, who are attending this meetup, would not know about it. So let us focus on that a little bit. So how does it develop in an infant?
Yeah, so we are born premature. And that's probably the reason we made it through the end of the Pleistocene and Heidelbergenesis and Neanderthals didn't. And I can show you why that is actual. So because we're born immature, all other animals, when they're first born, they're born on a terrain, grass, beachfront, rocks. That is what is burned into their nervous system as their brain constructs a model of the world that they're going to move in, which means prediction at the sub-second level and confirmation over and over again. The human infant's terrain is none of that. It's a living person's body at the sub-second level. And so I could say all this stuff, but I was still scared to say it until I was asked to review this book, Cognitive Gadgets by Cecilia Hayes. And she kind of supplied me with what I needed for these. She doesn't believe that imitation is genetic or that other things are often taken. And I sort of didn't either, but I didn't know exactly what to say about it. So what happens very, very quickly in the first few moments, hours, the human infant, given the intimacy that it has to have with another person, the ability to imitate looks, for all practical purposes, happens so quickly that it appears to be given in the genes. And the same thing for rhythm. And we can talk about what rhythm is. It's a very sub-second prediction. And then all music is roughly built around 120 beats a second, a little slower, a little faster, but it's all within the range in which a human can move and hear and join in with. And so that's what happens with the human infant. The infant realizes fairly quickly on, it can engage with the mother, she will engage back. And it's like a dance. In fact, it's a precursor to dance. And if you don't go through this stage, you won't be a really good dancer, or you may not be able to do it at all. So that's the most important thing there. Born premature, this intimacy with a caregiver, very quick expectation, and this is Bayesian, and it is predictive coding. That's the umbrella term these days it's covered under, that our brain is an organ of prediction, and it's working that way at birth, and it's working in fortunately a very caring environment in which prediction and confirmation is verified by a larger entity who is doing the same thing. And once this happens, you can't turn it off. That's what you are. You're an entity that seeks this out. And that's why all cultures dance. And that's why all cultures we know of talk, because it's this you go, then I go, then you, that's phasic. And you can watch that emerge in infancy from vocalization to pause, all the way up to phrase, pause, to the conversational level. So conversation emerges out of this rhythmic entrainment, but the most important thing about it, it's a trusting relationship. And because of that, the the expectations you have can be violated. Normally that would be an alarm, and for an animal, they get out of there. But here it's okay, but only because it happened in the first year in a very nurtured environment. It's okay to be wrong. You recover from it. And ordinary learning takes place out of being wrong, but it has to be in this setting. So I don't know how well I did. That's the basic.
Yeah, that was excellent. So I just want to add, I want to cap it off with the final stage of this, where the infant grasps that the mother has a different context, that there is something going on inside her head, as opposed to just everything going on. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So Michael Tomasello calls it the 9-month miracle. And at 9 months, there is a group of behaviors that the human infant begins showing that no chimp has ever, who raised in the same way, displayed. And they are pointing for the adult, following the adult's point, giving things to the adult, sharing things with the adult, teasing with the adult. If a new object comes into the room, they look to the adult. Whatever affect the adult displays, that is mapped onto that. So all these are the first indicators that the child is now sensitive to the psychological states of the caregiver, the giving, the teasing, the pointing, the show. It's not just body language that the infant is interested in. And that's because they have shared such an intimate rhythmic engagement up to 9 months. At that point, it changes from dyadic, the infant, the caregiver, you and me, to triadic. The adult begins introducing the child to a third object. And it's done in a way that no other animal has access to. Now the child is experiencing this object through all those nuances that it experienced the other person. Wow. And they're jointly constructing what this object means. But the child really is seeing that object from their experience. And then one day, to answer your question, the third object that the adult is focused on is the infant herself. And that is totally a transcendental moment, in my opinion. It's non-conscious, but it should very real, that it should be, oh wow, what is going on here? A moment that the adult turns, you're truly seeing yourself. It's not a physical mirror, it's a virtual mirror that totally dependent on all the other things that preceded it.
Wow. We will come to this when we talk about, conscious interiority of, Julian Jaynes. So you studied this topic. What else did you pursue in Jaynes?
Well, for a while, I pursued the literature on auditory verbal hallucinations. And I quit that. A lot of those papers just were looking for a pathology. Well, we're going to figure out what went wrong with the brain. That kind of didn't work for me, but I didn't know why. But through now I think I do. But it's the same answer, by the way, that the predictive coding that I talked about. So I don't know if you know, the people who study this, the brain is an organ of prediction. They say that everything is a hallucination. It's a controlled hallucination. The brain does not have time. The conduction velocities of axons could never inform an organism of what is predator or friend. The brain has to live in the future. It has to make the best guess. If you're in Big Sur, you're walking, you hear a rustle, you look down, you see a snake. You jump, you look back, it's a twig. But you saw a snake. And the reason you did is in that tense moment, the predictive brain said, I got to save this person. I'm going to give them a snake. But that's happening right now as we look around the room. The psychologists will tell you there's object constancies of all kinds that aren't really what's on the retina, that inform us of a stable universe. So that's where the voices. So the the brain is especially concerned with moments when it doesn't know what is happening, and it creates its best guess. That's exactly what happens with auditory verbal hallucinations. It's perfectly normal in that we have burned into our brain the admonitions of our caregivers. Those are very strong, do not do that. Don't touch the VCR. Stop that. You are bad. And they are the terrible twos. And they're very necessary to overcome. By that, the terrible twos happens because the child has acquired very sophisticated movement skills. And now they have to know when to inhibit those. And we do not typically teach the child what not to do, when to inhibit it, like they may have in the old days with maybe a slap on the back of the head or a push or remove it. We verbally code what not to do. And so that's burned in there. And then that is what the brain has available to it, or the mind, at an uncertain moment. So it's really no different than the snake. The child is not sure what to do, or the adult, the 19-year-old adult who's about to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, doesn't know what to do. And so the voice comes as a phenomenologically real one, just in the same way that the snake was phenomenologically real. So that's where I came down. I wanted to figure out why auditory verbal hallucinations. It was given to me through this community of people who study predictive coding. And I can give you the names of those people if you'd like to hold them accountable.
This is really interesting because what it does, I think the evidence from child development, actually corroborates the evidence that Jaynes marshals.
I think so.
For, from looking at history. So it's kind of like Evo Devo, the child is going through those cultural stages inside while growing, just like we did over a long period of time. So it's kind of the cultural version of Evo Devo going on. So it's really, really fascinating. So let me jump now to, what do you think is the importance of Julian Jaynes' ideas? What do you think people can learn from it? What does it, which of those ideas give a fundamentally new answers or raise new questions? So what is the contribution of Julian Jaynes?
Probably I think the most important was his informing us that we are metaphorical beings. Mm-hmm. He wasn't the only one that was moving up on it. George Lakoff's book, Metaphors We Live By, came out roughly the same time. Mm-hmm. And then shortly after that, well, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson co-wrote Metaphors We Live By, but shortly after that, Mark Johnson wrote a book called The Body in the Mind. That's pretty Jaynesian right there. Mm-hmm. But Jaynes told the story. So they were all lifting metaphor out of the common understanding that it's just a flowery adornment. By the end of the 70s, a lot of people from the linguistic communities and cognitive psychology were coming up on this, that metaphor, we are metaphorical beings. And Jaynes, I think, hammered that in pretty well. In fact, I think he has something like a metaphor me, mm-hmm. An analog I. I think this is important because it really does reshape our concept of what we are as entities. And I think it also shows the commonality that we all have. We all derive ourselves from the community that we live in. This is non-optional. This most essential self. Maybe I mentioned last time I grew up thinking I was Irish because my mother said, "You're Irish." And I'd never been to Ireland, but boy, I was Irish. And so that was the community that I was in. Of course, that's not metaphorical, but so I think that's probably the most important thing. It's a reshaping of what we are. And it focuses on what I think is also real, and that is the community is vitally important. We're Westerners, weird, weird people, W-E-I-R-D, Western, what is it, educated, W-E-I, individualistic, rich, and democratic. So it's basically the Western world. We think we're individuals, strong individuals that do everything on our own. And we tend not to realize you have to be socialized to be an individual. You have to be socialized as an independent agent. You're still carrying the community around inside of you. And Jaynes simply made that very clear with his prose, that we are metaphorical beings. I think that's a huge one.
Let me go ahead and ask more questions because people who are not familiar with Jaynes may not get what does it mean to be a metaphorical being. What does it mean to be a metaphorical being?
Well, part of it is, well, that's where he brings up analog I and a metaphor me. So as we're being shaped as young adults, for instance, we're learning to have a lexical description of what it means to understand something. How does a child express, I know what you're talking about? So there can be two different metaphors that are common. I could say, oh, I get it. I get what you're saying. That's a grasping metaphor. Or I could say, oh, I see what you're saying now. So that is a visual metaphor. Now, both of those, once you've done that, you've created an analog I. Jaynes says this. He said, the analog I is contentless, he says, though. It's a point, he says. It's like a mathematical, it's a relationship. And so let's take the first metaphor. I get what you're saying. So you're familiar with the people, I guess I'm talking to everybody out there. Jaynes had a thing that once you use a metaphor operates on any reactivity. In this case, the metaphor is drawing upon the source domain of grasping and holding. And I learned to say, I get it. I get what you're saying. Well, now the analog I is a thing that is assumed to be there because you can't get something and hold it if there's not an arm with an agent behind it. So that's the analog part. It's an assumed thing that has to be there, but it has a different character depending on the metaphor you use. So the metaphor for grasping is kind of a more aggressive analog. It means reaching out, taking possession of and holding. That's very different than if you say, oh, I see. That's more passive. So that analog I has a different feel and a different character. The same thing with time. There are at least two cultures that time, the future is behind you. And we take it for granted that the future is in front of us. But it all depends on the metaphor that you want to use. The cultures that have time, that have the past in front of them, the metaphor they draw upon is one of being able to survey something. And you can look at your past and think about it as you can look at what's in front of you and think about it. So for them, the future is sneaking up from behind and coming into the past in front of them. And that has a different feel to it. Ours is kind of a more aggressive. We are moving into the future. We're agents that are on the move. We're not passively waiting for the future to come and go by. So that's part of how metaphors shape the character of the I. And it's huge. It's enormous.
Wow.
The variation.
This is fantastic. I want to spend a couple more minutes on it. So what is happening is that, we create this space inside our head. When we say, I see, I grasp, there is an equivalent of a physical action or physical things that there is a metaphor. We are using that as a metaphor in order to refer to what you're doing inside your head. And you are inside your head, you are an actor and you're doing things. And the way in which you're doing things it's kind of shaped by the metaphors that you're
By the
using. So for example, when you're seeing time as sneaking up from behind and past in front of you, it's a very passive status that you
Yeah,
have inside your head. You're saying, I don't know what's going to happen to me. It will come, it'll come to me.
exactly.
Whereas a culture like ours, where we see future in front of us and past behind us, we are saying, I am charging into the future. I better look very
Get out of my way,
carefully.
man.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I better look very carefully. I will use whatever from the past I can muster in order to predict and, plan out things as best as I can. So you would see into the future, again, using using a
the metaphor.
metaphor. Whereas, for those other people, actually the future comes and grabs you from behind, and you are a passive reaction to that.
You might be happier that way. I think some traditional cultures are. They don't feel like they have to rush into the future and take possession of it.
But the interesting part is that the way in which you use metaphors is really shaping how you are viewing your entire life, and your conscious experience of it, your self-conscious experience of living is being shaped by the metaphors that you're using.
It's shaping your nervous system, even that immediate character of being alive, because you're also the predictive part of being a predictive entity is you're always priming your proprioceptors, the little muscles inside your muscle. And the way you prime those is part of the metaphor that you have. If you're a more anxious person who wants to charge in the future, your body tone will be different. And it's identifiably different by the way that you can see some way they hold their body. Everybody's body tone is set by this constant repositioning of the proprioceptors. That sets the tone of your muscles. Wow. And those are at the mercy also of the metaphors your culture has chosen for you to think of yourself. It's extremely, Jaynes gave us that.
Yes. Wonderful. So that was one of the ideas. What other ideas would you say that if a person wants to say, what did Jaynes have to offer? What other ideas would you put in that category, saying these are the big ideas of Julian Jaynes?
Well, I think he kind of liberated us from, for instance, the idea that hallucinations are bad, for starters, but also that what hypnotism is, that it's not a pathology, it's not a strange thing. It's part of what it means to be a social being. Because in hypnotism, you do turn yourself over to somebody. And so that's another thing that used to sit on the table. Jaynes had a name for it. I don't know, the black sheep of psychology or something. And I think that black sheep sitting, well, I don't want to, we have sheep and I like them, black, white, or whatever they are. But nevertheless, he may have used that term. That needed to be taken care of because it's just one more way to think of ourselves as flawed entities, which I guess we are. I'm not saying we're not flawed in that way. Hypnotism is actually part of what it means to be a conscious social entity. That has always stood out for me. Those may be the big ones, unless you can nudge me a little further.
Sure. Let me approach it from another angle. Now, you spent a lot of time reviewing his book for some publications, right?
Yes. I wrote the American, in 2012, the American Journal of Psychology gave me all 4 issues. And I just went crazy.
So talk a little bit about that experience. What did you cover? What was the reception like?
Yeah, well, I tried to cover everything. I had all 4 issues in that year. One thing, I went after people who went after him. Ian McGilchrist, for instance, the master and his emissary. That was a beautiful book. but he misread Jaynes. So I went after Ian McGilchrist and fixed that. Other than that, I did kind of stick to a lot of the things we've been talking about. I poured in my child development thing. So I spent a lot of time adding that. And that's probably it. I didn't want to trample on Jaynes. I didn't want to pretend, that, I was Julian Jaynes. So I stuck with defending him pretty much. I probably cleared up a few things that it was not the volcano of Thera that initiated the ancient dark age. He had the date wrong. It wasn't around 1200. It was earlier than that. That did not, hurt his theory. I don't know. Do you know that that's maybe the audience doesn't know?
No, probably they don't.
The part of Jaynes, the transition from Bronze Age non-conscious to Iron Age urban conscious. Civilization collapsed in the Mediterranean basin at around 1200 BC and stayed dark till around 700. And when the lights came back on, they were blazing. More ordinary people were living in cosmopolitan urban settings around strangers and making more personal decisions per day. Huge change from the Bronze Age. Jaynes surmised that it was the volcano that is well known to historians that erupted and caused all the turmoil, tidal waves, and other. That is turned out not to be the case. So I corrected that. And I reviewed two other theories of the collapse of the ancient Bronze Age. One is called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed or died. And then, and I forget the title of the other one, something like collapse of the Bronze Age. Both of those theories, though, don't do the job. And that's what I did. I spent a lot of time on and books continue to come out to explain the ancient dark age. The book that I'm blanking on the name of, he credited it to a new kind of sword, which caused a new kind of disruption in the Mediterranean basin. The other book is more sophisticated, 1177 BC. I recommend reading it, though, because Jaynes still needs this disruption at 1200 BC. His theory was that the civilizations were too tightly coupled. It was a dynamic, unstable, chaotic system. One little thing could go wrong and it would, the house of cards would collapse. So I spent a lot of time on those two theories and then adding my own, which was just a gentle introduction of Julian Jaynes, that all you needed was cultures that were moving increasingly toward urbanization. And what that meant was ordinary people were not raising their children prior to that to deal with strangers. Most ordinary people still grew up with people around them. They didn't have to interpret another person's mental states. There weren't no mental, in the lexicon, you can read Brian McVeigh's books. There were no mental state words in Bronze Age lexicon. So I just supplied that. I said, as you move toward urbanization, which from China to the Indus River Valley to Mesopotamia to Greece to North Africa, everybody was embracing this cosmopolitan urban life. And that was very, very stressful for individuals. They had to learn the conversation. They had to learn to a new kind of currency to deal with life among strangers. So I did that. So you've been encouraging me to remember what all I did.
Wonderful. No, that's fascinating because it connects to the original question that you had about conversation, that you have to actually figure out the mental context, interpret the mental context of another human being in order, and whom you do not already know,
Yeah.
that you did not grow up with, and do that as a requirement. So it just increases the need for your conscious processing. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to open it up. There are some amazing people in the in this call, so I'm going to encourage other people to ask questions as well. So my last question, folks, go ahead and line up for asking questions for Bill by typing exclamation mark. Keep on topic, be brief, and feel free to disagree with anybody on anything courteously. All right. So last question, Bill. What do you think is the future of development of Jaynesian idea? What areas excite you, where work is going on either by yourself or by other people? Where can we, what can we understand better as a result?
Well, I am working on a short piece called The Third Soul. And so the first soul, I claim, is the Platonic one. And I think that was invented because by roughly 500, 400, 300 BC, philosophers had only been invented a few hundred years for the very purpose of dealing with this new, what have we got on our hands, this conscious self. And they weren't getting anywhere, as nobody is anyway. So I think that theater was invented at the same time, around 700 BC. Poetry celebrating the individual, the problems of the individual, was developed at the same time. And philosophy came along to figure it out. Failing to do it, I think the first soul was a safe place to put mystery. We're not going to solve this, Plato and friends said, because it's pretty hard to do. Because once you lexicalize the self, which is what happened, lexicalization of the self, other people, you can use the common currency as negotiation in this new complex world. However, like me, I knew I wasn't Irish. What do I do with that? So once you lexicalize yourself in these sharp, bounded categories, you're in a constant state of dissonance because it's not really true. It's useful, but there's always fuzzy edges. And so I think the first soul was a place to put mystery, a safe place. Yeah, we can't account for that, but that's your soul. So the second soul was in the 1700s when there was an equal crisis of understanding. And that's when people were living in even worse urban settings of industrialized wage labor. And these were conscious people, though, now. They were consciously aware of how they're being treated. And there were new illnesses today we would call psychosomatic, which the first person, Anton Mesmer, came along and he explained it in scientific terms. You've lost contact with the big magnetic field, and he came up with these therapies. But it worked. So it created another soul, the subterranean one, where the id and the ego, and they fight with each other like Olympian gods. But it worked because it was in the language of science. And from the 1700s to 1900, all psychotherapists were first, medical people first. And this now met the new need of people immersed in technical science world. Religion had lost its allure a little bit, but this old soul didn't go away. You still got the one that floats or wherever it is. Now you got one inside of you, couched in the language that you're familiar with. And now I say, we got another crisis. And that is, anthropologists will often tell you, whatever it is that you depend upon and are intimate with, you will have to come up with a narrative to make it seem normal. And what are we living closer and closer to and more dependent upon? Informatic devices, informatic machines. Hospitals are filled with machines. And authorities, people who write books on this and interview on television, just say that we are information. So the third soul is the informatic one. It's as ethereal as the other two because it can flow between machines. It's platform independent. I ask student after student after student in Santa Cruz, do you think the matrix could be real? Do you think you can be downloaded? And they say, Bill, what is wrong with you? Of course. Well, I'm just information that. So I think we're going to have a third soul soon. The first soul will always be there. The subterranean wind will always be there, but we'll have to find a way to talk about ourselves that is compatible with who knows what's coming. Prosthetics will soon, I don't know how soon, but will just be optional. I've worked in neuroscience for 20 years for people who want to make money by putting things in your brain. That looks like it's going to happen. So that's kind of where I see it's going. And at least for me, you ask, how is there anything I know that can help? Well, for me, at least helped me to understand, to contextualize it, especially in Jaynes. Everything I've just said, from the first soul to the second soul to the third one upcoming, is Jaynesian. They're all metaphors. But this particular metaphor will have to fit the informatic devices that are getting closer and closer and closer.
Bill, you at the end of the interview, you've started a fantastic topic. So we'll have to do a full meetup on that. I would love to talk to you in detail about that. But I want to give a chance for my friends here to ask questions. So folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to ask questions. It's going to be Joe, Bill Frezza, and Brian McQuay. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly, can you expand upon the idea of why we were seen as flawed entities if we were, because of hypnosis? I just have a little something written in my notes there. Yeah, could you expand upon that really briefly?
Well, it's not too big a deal, but it's mainly because we laugh at hypnosis. It's a trick that people do on stage. And so if you read, the head, Marcel Keitzens, he's head of the Julian Jaynes Society, you'll learn more about hypnosis. And so I think it is a quite normal behavior as the social entities which we are, which I think it's important that we understand how social we are. And that one little thing hanging out there detracts from our ability to understand what social creatures we are. That hypnosis, which is a very strong indicator of how we give control over to other people and are okay with it. So maybe I said it too strongly, but that's what I meant, is it detracts it almost comically from something that is essentially human.
Thank you for that.
Next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
I have two questions, one very narrow and silly and one broader, which I hope will get you talking. The narrow and silly one is, you've talked about dance, rhythm, prosody, and language. Are we aware of any other animals, mammals, birds, reptiles that can keep a beat?
Yes and no. You can train them to keep a beat.
You can?
Yeah, you can train animals to do a lot of things. You can videotape them, and you can be moving your hand up and down while music is playing, and on the video it'll look like they're dancing. Animals do engage in rhythmic behavior. You can see videos of elephants who are tied down and they rock back and forth, and they just keep it up. In one sense, like similar to autistic children, the reason they do repetitive behaviors is because they can't control around other people. It makes them nervous. They don't understand other people. So they have trouble with that prediction verification. So they just do repeat things. It's very comforting to repeat. And so animals do have some of this, but you don't see animals dancing together. They'll do calls together, back and forth calls. But I looked for it when I wrote sort of the first practice paper in the 90s, and I couldn't find any examples of animals dancing. And the most important thing about dancing is you do it with other people. Not that you can't entrain with a pulse, but we form expectations at the sub-second level of another person, and they form it of us. Together you form a virtual third person, and that third person can't be predicted on the basis of either one of them alone. And I haven't seen anything in the animal world that comes close to that.
Fascinating. My broader question has to do with religion and its role in history, its role in the formation of consciousness. In this discussion group we're part of, I often call it the God-shaped hole in our heads. and something always seems to go in there and fill that. How, from a Jaynesian perspective, how do you see the nature of religion transforming itself from one side of the Dark Ages to the other?
Yeah, so what I was quite surprised. I was non-religious. I grew up Irish Catholic. At the time I hit adulthood, I kind of walked away. And so by the time I read Jaynes, I was, fairly secular. I was surprised at how gentle he was toward religion, a person who I knew was not religion, how he expressed awe at the beauty of religious psalms and songs and poems and cathedrals. He never criticized it. And in fact, at the end of his book, he said that my agenda in this book is no different than theirs. I don't know if you've read his book, but he's quite clear about it.
I don't
It's
remember
the
that
same,
part.
the same agenda.
Interesting.
And the reason he was right, sort of right in doing that, to answer your question another way, the term axial age, coined by Carl Jasper. So it's 500 BC plus or minus 200 years. All the following come into existence: Jainism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism of the book, Greek rationalism, and they all happen 500 BC plus or minus 200. And if you subtract the gods out from those, you got something in common. And what you have in common is kind of what Srikant mentioned just a moment ago: how to get along with strangers in a high decision rate per hour environment. Religion did it. So religion stepped up to the plate at around 500 BC to solve the problem. I don't see the quote here. I got a quote by a historian of religion, and his name is Luther Martin, who says that people were thrust into an individualism without instruction. His characteristics of the first millennium BC was of people under severe stress. Yes, the Jaynesian consciousness came along. We developed a lexicon of mental terms that could be exchanged. That worked, but it also introduced what Jaynes said, the first crazy person. There's no words in the Bronze Age for mentally ill. There's words for stupid and idiot and everything else, but no mental illness. But mental illness naturally follows the onset of, at the cultural level, categorizing yourself in sharp categories, knowing all the time you're an analog creature. And if you want to see this, just listen to somebody describe you to another person. It will drive you crazy. And so did I divert from your question?
Oh, yes, but fine.
Oh.
That's okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill, for that question. And I love the brain halo that you have. Next up
Yes.
is Brian, followed by Kevin. Brian.
Yeah, Bill, the one thing that I'm curious how you would respond, going back to this hard problem of consciousness. And so we hear this a lot, this sort of comparison of easy problems that come in psychology versus hard problems. And of course, consciousness is a hard problem. And I'm just, to me, that's really the basic division that we have anytime we talk about something like consciousness. And so you have one group of people who think that this hard problem of consciousness, it's just a matter of time. We can sort of apply the right instrumentation, come up with the right theory, and we'll all figure it out. And the mystery of consciousness will just evaporate. And that may happen. But in any case, my question is, what would you say to a neuroscientist? And this is not to knock neuropsychologists or neuroscientists, but I'm just sort of curious, what would you say to them about how you think consciousness should be approached as a hard problem. I mean, it seems that some people deny that there is a hard problem, at least some neuroscientists. And I think that's the issue. I think that's why there's so many obstacles. They just seem to think that everything can be reduced to an easy problem, when in fact, it's much more complicated than that. So I'm just sort of wondering what type of response.
I've talked to a lot of them. After leaving physics, I worked for 20 years in neuroscience. And so I would go to conference and these are all brain implants. In fact, for 20 years, I made brain implants at my house, custom brain implants for animal studies. And I tried to have conversations with neuroscientists. It was a non-starter. But when you ask them what they have to offer, it always comes down to the same thing: the neural correlates of consciousness. That's the buzzword that floats within this community. And that reveals something that it's clear they have not identified the sweet thing that they're after. They've identified a correlate. So they've identified a neural flurry that may correlate with a person in laboratory. I see red, but that's just a correlate. And it's fine. There is nothing wrong with that. But that's the best they've come up with, unless you'll find somebody who will say they know what it is, but then you say, please tell me, you're off to a second six-pack now. You really have to start drinking heavy. I haven't seen anything from that community other than a neural correlate to something that can be a perception that can be measured in a lab. But what I think another thing we owe Jaynes, he pointed out very clearly that if you look at what all people mean when they get that aha moment, it's they have arrived at a metaphor for this phenomenon that they're wrestling with. I want to know what an economy is. Well, somebody says, it's like a building because it can collapse. And so that Jaynes was pretty clear. He said, I don't know if I have the exact quote, that there, as far as immediate experience goes, you will never have that aha moment because there's nothing that immediate experience can be like. It is ground floor. And that's what he believed. And the moment I read it, I believed it. And I haven't seen anything, as long as it's clear we're talking about immediate experience, first order, whatever it is like. And I don't know that you could ever get there, because if you think about it, when we tell each other what our conscious moment was like, it's always an exertion. I saw Brian, I heard the song. When in fact, at that moment, our entire body was functioning. So probably when you learn to meditate and stop telling yourself a story, you're at peace with a million sensations, your whole body. But that cannot be captured. Those who tell don't know, and those who know don't tell. You can't capture all those. So it's amazing what consciousness does. It plucks out of that milieu of whatever it is like the whole body be working, and gives the illusion that you just had one experience. So I drifted a little, but the neuroscience people that I've worked with have never offered, the answer. It's still a hard problem. And Jaynes, I think, nailed it by saying, well, maybe you could explain it better, but you will not have that experience you're hoping for, the aha one.
Wonderful. Folks, we're going to do breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. And please come back with the best question that you have for Bill. Starting the breakout rooms now. Right. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right. So it's time. Welcome back, everybody. It's time for final questions for Bill. I know that Kevin had a question, so we'll start with Kevin. But anybody else who has, the best question that they have for Bill. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Suanka. Thank you, Bill. My question is regarding the metaphor. James mentioned that human is a metaphysical being. So from what's dangerous, we lose like those connects with metaphor. We less use value those metaphors why use our daily life. And for me, metaphor is good tools to acquire new knowledge or connect with different disciplinary. So what's the danger do you see? Thank you.
Bill, you need to unmute.
Okay. Yeah, could somebody help me? I wasn't sure the
Yeah,
dangers of
the question is that Kevin is saying that we are metaphorical beings. Is there a danger that you can lose connection with the metaphors that have built you, and is what is the, and he was saying that metaphors are useful to him. He uses them all the time. Do we have to do something in order to kind of keep our connection to metaphors? What?
Well, the answer is yes, in all capital letters, underlined and in italics. The problem or the beauty of metaphors is they will not hold still throughout your lifetime. You know, I'm no longer Irish like I was when I was little. I totally, you know, my family was just Irish Catholic, and it was important to be that. But so the metaphors will change. I mean, we are fluid creatures, and that is part of the problem. I mean, in the modern world, it never stops. Be all you can be. Find yourself. You hear this, and it's almost heartbreaking. You know, young people. You know, oh, I got to find out who I really am. I got to, and so the metaphors. There is a hazard. The beauty of metaphors in that they're infinite. Well, it also has the other side of that coin is, are we capable of experiencing so many changes over a lifetime? Something probably needs to be done some way. Brian has a therapy built around Jaynesian stuff, which might help. But right now, it is a problem. The metaphors are inherently fragile. They're inherently agile also. But we have to learn to deal with a changing self over time because of it.
Wonderful. I just want to say that, you know, I study idioms. One of the things I looked at was idioms and history of idioms. And it's quite stunning how there is a parallel between development of idioms and development of society and ways of thinking. So for example, I looked at the just the time, timeline of idioms. And you see that with 19th century, idioms just take off. They just take off like a rocket. For example, every time there is experience with, let's say, experience with railroads, you have all these new idioms coming into being. Is you know, keep on track, one track mind, fire in the belly. It just goes on and on and on, like at least about like 50 different terms capturing that. And that's happening all the time. So that people don't realize how dynamic the language is, that it is a conversation and these metaphors are being built. And in that sense, our consciousness, one of the things that I really like about Julian Jaynes is there is a video that I watched of him, and he's saying that consciousness is one of our greatest heritage, and we are building it now. We are in the process of it's not a static thing. It's something that it's a cultural creation, and you keep building it. So it's a profoundly forward-looking and actually optimistic view.
It is. I agree.
Next up is Brian.
So I actually, speaking of metaphors, I remember reading years ago, the philosopher Nietzsche wrote that the truth is a mobile army of metaphors. And I think that's a really powerful way to look at things. And the idea is not just with consciousness, but any piece of human knowledge, any type of sort of scientific theory really is grounded somehow rooted in metaphors. And then the other thing I wanted to say, this is not so much a question, but I'd still like to hear if you have a response. This idea developed by Clark and David Chalmers, extended mind thesis, the extended mind thesis, this idea that the mind cannot be understood as something reducible to the brain in your skull. Rather, the mind is cannibalistic. And what they mean is that the mind is constantly living off the environment. It's constantly absorbing things. It has to rely on tools. It has to rely on information from outside itself in order to accomplish anything. And of course, I think metaphors is a good example of that. Basically, that's what a metaphor is. The mind is borrowing something from the environment in order to deal with a situation, in order to explain something to itself or explain something to other people. But in any case, this extended mind theory, extended mind thesis, I think is very powerful because it shows us that the mind is very much interconnected, interlinked, networked throughout its environment. And I think this is something that bumps up, that many people have a problem with. It sort of bumps up against a sort of conventional type of science where we want to reduce everything. And of course, reductionism has its role. It's that is what science has to do in certain situations. But there are other situations where a very reductionistic approach doesn't really work, and we have to take a more environmental or a more ecological perspective. And I think that mind is one of those examples. So in any case, that's just sort of a, like I said, a comment, but I'd be curious if you had anything to say about that.
Well, that's what Jaynes said. He said that the metaphor, the forms of metaphor me, operates on any reactivity. And so what is a reactivity? It totally depends upon the technology that body is in. You know, do you walk a forest floor with trees around you, or do you walk a straight street, which everything is defined? So what your body interacts with. So they were right. I agree with them. From what Jaynes said, since the metaphorical self is created by borrowing from how the body interacts with its local environment, the mind will be whatever the local environment is. It has no choice but to join in with that. And, you know, that's fine. But yeah, I think they got it right. Yeah, Chalmers and Clark, it seems like a strange mix. But I mean, I like Andy Clark. It is Andy Clark you're thinking of,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Andy Clark, yeah.
And
Wonderful. Next question is from Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Another question about the soul. Let's see if we virtual third soul comes, then let's say if one day I can download my mind. So it's look like I'm a robot. Possible I'm not who I am. So it's I kind of see kind of dangers from a narrow mind. What do you think about that? That's going to, what's the bottom line for ourselves as human beings?
you mean like a mind that's independent of the technology, and an essential mind that's independent of things?
I mean, let's see, we human like now, the information knowledge is overcrowded. We don't need such. If we possibly need, what's the bottom line for ourselves? We keep, let's see, learning, doing, you know, since involved, we keep, you know, our old soul doesn't work. So we need to evolve to a new soul.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, Jaynes really did say that insanity came along with the metaphorical self, the invention of it. So it is inherently problematic, and you always will have to have, and that's why all those religions were invented right on time. just when the crisis happens, the whole civilizations trying to understand themselves as sharp categories. That will never be comfortable. And, you know, almost all poetry, almost all songs, or you can just listen to them. They're attempts to try to figure out a problem of me. So it is forever a problem, but then there are people who love that because you'll solve the problem and you'll become another kind of metaphorical being. I don't know. Some people can handle that though, and others can't. I think it's, I mean, I see it around me, you know, just make a list of the number of therapists and clinicians and self-help books. They all, I think, speak to this idea that the metaphorical self is a little too fluid and we need help. Religion was the first help. And now we have therapists. Brian is working on a Jaynesian version. By the time we become cyborgs, maybe it won't be a problem anymore.
Next one, question from Mike. Mike, what's your question?
In the breakout session, you mentioned microtubules as a possible mechanism for the emergent properties of consciousness. But we didn't go into it with any depth. Do you have anything further to say about that might shed some light on that? I've noticed there's a lot of literature on that concept.
Right, there is. I couldn't, you know, I have a degree in physics. I didn't see any essential link between quantum mechanics and the ability to report a phenomenal experience. What I saw was people attempting to find the quantum correlates of phenomenal experience. That's as close, and so they came no closer than the brain people who study single brain cells or small populations. They don't get any closer to consciousness either. They will discover a correlate, something about brain activity that reliably varies with the personal report, but it is not the same thing as, and the microtubule people, I don't think have, I think they're even in worse shape than the neural people because it's so far removed. And I worked in physics, high energy physics. I didn't meet anybody who understands quantum mechanics, and most people don't pretend to. So if you don't understand quantum mechanics, but one does, it's like explaining a murky problem with an unclear one.
Thank you. So Bill, this was fantastic, and I look forward to having you back to talk about these three souls, because we've done a full meetup with Merlin Donald. I don't know, are you familiar with the work of Merlin
sure,
Donald?
Of course. Yeah, I should have mentioned him today because he talks about the externalization of memory in the ancient world.
Yeah, so we've talked about that. He's also talked about the fourth stage that he sees we are already in. So it will be very interesting to see that. I'll send you the videos of the meetups we did with him. And I look forward to having you, we can talk about the three souls or any other topic on Jaynes that you would like to discuss. So it's wonderful having you here. And thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Bill.
Thanks, everyone.
See you. Bye.
Bye.